Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile and short-range missiles to show an ability to strike both the U.S. and South Korea with nuclear weapons. The U.S. and South Korea held a simulated military exercise in Washington, focusing on their response to North Korea's possible nuclear weapons use. Today, we discuss the ramifications of North Korea's latest missile launches.
This is yet again a provocative act by North Korea in violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions.
North Korea will face more severe sanctions by the international community. Pyongyang will gain nothing from its provocation.
In the studio with me, Mr. Christopher Johnstone, Senior Advisor and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Johnstone was the Director for East Asia at the National Security Council under President Biden. He also served as the Director for Japan and Oceanian Affairs at the NSC. Also joining us, Colonel David Maxwell, the Vice President of the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy and a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Colonel Maxwell was a former military planner for the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Johnstone, North Korea fired an intercontinental ballistic missile for the first time in 3 months. Back in December, Kim Yo-jong said that North Korea will fire an ICBM on a normal trajectory. United States is reacting strongly to Chinese spy balloons. Shouldn't the U.S. react even stronger to the threats of North Korea firing ICBM on a normal trajectory and threats to use the Pacific as its firing range?
Yeah, there's no question that if North Korea launches an ICBM on a normal trajectory and it threatens the mainland or it threatens our allies, I'm certain that the administration will have a very strong response. I don't want to speculate about what that response would be, but I'm confident that the response would be strong. I think if it's on a trajectory that doesn't threaten our allies or ourselves, it actually represents an excellent intelligence collection opportunity to learn a lot about their capability and how to defend against it. So this will be something to watch, certainly. I do think it's important to say that I think the administration's response to the provocations that we've seen in the last few weeks has been quite strong. The trilateral missile defense exercise with the ROK in Japan demonstrated our defensive capabilities. The B-1 bomber flight, escorted by fighters from the ROK and from Japan, demonstrated our offensive capabilities. And then the tabletop exercise that was conducted this week demonstrates how we're preparing. And the readout of that exercise, very significant. It reiterated the commitment in the nuclear posture review that any nuclear attack by North Korea against the United States or our allies, any nuclear attack is unacceptable and will result in the end of the regime. That's strong language, and I think a good response to what we've seen.
Colonel Maxwell, South Korean lawmakers citing intelligence officials say that North Korea has all the capabilities to launch ICBM on a normal trajectory and only is looking at the best timing to do that. What will be the ramifications to the defending Asian allies and the U.S. mainland should that really happen?
Well, I agree with everything that Christopher said. And I think that this illustrates why we need to have, one, in the region, an integrated missile defense capability, and two, why we have to continue to invest in our capabilities for ground-based interceptors, really to protect the homeland. And so I think that if North Korea does launch an ICBM on a normal trajectory, again, we'll gather intelligence. But I also think that we need to step back and look at Kim Jong-un's strategy and why he is doing this. And I think that it actually, although this is counterintuitive, represents a failure of Kim Jong-un's strategy, because he has failed to get sanctions relief. He has failed to split the ROK-US alliance. And we should look at this at every single provocation. The ROK-US alliance, the Japan-US alliance, and trilateral cooperation are all improving and getting stronger.
Let's talk about that trilateral cooperation later a bit in the program. Now, Mr. Johnstone, after the Soviet Union got the ability to strike U.S. mainland during the Cold War, the United States changed its arrangement, made new arrangements with its European allies. So should North Korea reliably have the ability to strike U.S. mainland with nuclear weapons, would that fundamentally change the nature of the ROK-U.S. alliance?
Yeah, I think it's important to note sort of up front that the U.S. intelligence community has assessed for some time that North Korea has the ability to strike the U.S. mainland with an ICBM. So in that sense, it's not new, and it's motivated U.S. investments in missile defense and other capabilities for close to a decade at this point. But there's no question that North Korea's capabilities are evolving, getting more sophisticated, more complex. But U.S. capabilities are evolving too, and those of our allies are evolving too. And I do think, to your question on allies, one of the signature dimensions of this administration's policy has been to place a priority on alliances. Not just to say we like alliances and we like our allies, but to actually empower our allies with more capabilities. We saw that with the ROK, with the lifting of limits on the South Korean missile capabilities. We see it with Japan, with explicit U.S. support for Japan to develop a strike capability. We see it with Australia, with support for Australia's desire to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, also a game changer. So this sense that our allies are becoming more capable and part of the deterrence picture, I think, is very important. And to Dave's point, I think a positive result of some of what we've seen in the region.
The missile range limitation was only lifted recently, and there are still many limitations that South Korea faces in terms of military capabilities. What do you mean by U.S. has empowered South Korea as an ally?
What I mean is that there is strong support for the modernization, the advancement of South Korea's capabilities, whether it's in missile defense, F-35 aircraft, missile forces. The United States welcomes a strong South Korea in the same way that it welcomes a strong Japan, a strong Australia. And again, it's that sense that we're coming together in a web of relationships, not just a hub and spoke, that I think contributes to the deterrence picture.
Now, Colonel Maxwell, Deterrence Strategy Committee tabletop exercises were held in Washington, just like how Mr. Johnstone mentioned. The exercises started from 2011, and this is the 8th round. The latest round comes at a time when North Korea's nuclear threat is very heightened. How should the latest round should have been different from before, and what promises should have been made in this latest round?
Well, I think certainly number one is the commitment to extended deterrence was absolutely reinforced. And as Chris said, that if North Korea uses nuclear weapons, then the regime will cease to exist. And so I think that has been reinforced. I think that the exercise itself, of course, is classified, and we will never know the details of that. But I'm sure that they worked on all aspects of targeting, how they will go about employing all manner of weapons, including up to and including nuclear weapons. Remember, we don't need to use nuclear weapons to destroy much of North Korea. So they will be used prudently at the right time. And I think this kind of exercise really goes a long way, one, toward educating both U.S. and ROK military leaders, and really working on the processes that they will use to defend South Korea from any attack by North Korea with weapons of mass destruction.
This particular tabletop exercise started in 2011, and this is the 8th round. But putting so much emphasis on the latest round of exercises and so much attention and the nuclear scenario, is it because the President Yoon Suk-yeol mentioned about the policy option of a nuclear policy option? And is it because there is a public sentiment in South Korea that they want nuclear weapons?
I think all these factors, impact on that, and I think the U.S. is being questioned in terms of our commitment. Other events that have taken place around the world, not related to Korea, do bring into question the U.S. commitment, which I think is a misunderstanding. I think the U.S. commitment to extended deterrence is absolute, and Kim Jong-un needs to understand that. But I think also the fact that normally these exercises take place really behind the scenes in a classified manner. But now with the development of North Korea's threats and the discussion of South Korea potentially obtaining nuclear weapons, I think it really is important to reinforce to the public the extensive work that is being done by our two militaries. And I also think that the discussion of South Korea obtaining nuclear weapons is really a positive indication. Although I don't think that South Korea needs them or should procure them, I do think that represents a strong commitment to the defense of South Korea, and that's something that we welcome. And I think these exercises go a long way to reinforcing the combined commitment to the defense of South Korea.
Now, we have to always think about the worst case scenario. Mr. Johnstone, North Korea says multiple rocket launchers is a means of tactical nuclear weapons. Should North Korea mount nuclear weapon, biological weapon, or a chemical weapon on the multiple rocket launcher and fired at air base in South Korea, wouldn't it be a serious damage to Allied operations in South Korea?
No question that this is a real threat, a new one, and that Kim Jong-un is seeking to develop really a spectrum of nuclear capability, from the low-end tactical capabilities all the way up to the ICBM-delivered multiple warhead capabilities. So we have to recognize that the threat has evolved, but this is where I come back to the very strong commitment that the administration, the U.S. government has made that any use, even a tactical use of nuclear weapons, would trigger a U.S. response that would result in the end of the regime. And the U.S. has not ruled out such a response in response to use of other forms of WMD, including chemical and biological weapons. So this is where deterrence is important, and clearly part of North Korea's game plan here is to try to find ways to drive seams between the U.S. and South Korea, the U.S. and Japan and South Korea. And so continuing our work to stitch together the trilateral relationship is also important here. And the good news is we're making progress on that front.
So North Korea has fired not only ICBM, but also short-range ballistic missiles in the past few days. Mr. Johnstone, North Korea sophisticating its missile technology. Isn't U.S. extended provided to South Korea already eroded on the margins?
Yeah, so I think first point on this is it's important to recognize there's always a baseline of concern among our allies about the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence. And it makes sense, right? That there would be always questions about, will the U.S. really be there in the event that the U.S. homeland is threatened with nuclear device? Will the U.S. really defend its allies in such a scenario? So that is there and is always the mission of the United States to find ways to address that concern. I do think that this is a time for the United States to consider additional steps to strengthen the credibility of nuclear deterrence, and of extended deterrence. And we're already seeing some of that, right? The elevation of the dialogue to a more senior level with South Korea. Discussions underway to do the same thing with Japan. I think we should think about bringing those extended deterrence dialogues together in a trilateral setting, again, to facilitate this coming together of the two alliances. I think we should consider looking at a joint nuclear planning framework that gives our allies more insight into U.S. decision-making related to nuclear weapons. And there may even be a time when it's worth considering building nuclear infrastructure in South Korea to support the reintroduction, should that decision be made. So I do think there are additional steps the United States can and should take. But at the end of the day, the U.S. has been very clear about how it would respond to nuclear use.
When you say joint nuclear planning, are you thinking trilateral with Japan? And would that be similar to what they have at NATO?
I think it would probably need to start bilaterally with South Korea. But yes, something similar to the structure that we have with NATO for nuclear planning. Again, the idea here is to give greater confidence on the part of our allies into how the United States would employ nuclear weapons and how the decision-making would work.
Now, Colonel Maxwell, does South Korea have the ability to defend against North Korea's tactical nuclear weapons attack? And isn't this the reason why, because of the weak defense capability, isn't this the why South Koreans want nuclear weapons themselves, to have nuclear parity with North Korea?
Well, I think that's an emotional argument. And I think that just possessing nuclear weapons by South Korea isn't going to improve its defense against North Korea's nuclear weapons. I think that people perceive that it may have a deterrent effect, which I think is questionable. To defend against North Korea's nuclear weapons, again, it takes missile defense. It takes precision strike of systems in the north. And so just having nuclear weapons does not really guarantee a defense against North Korea's nuclear weapons. It takes much more than that.
Colonel Maxwell, Ukraine ambassador to South Korea a few days ago in an interview with South Korean media said that Ukraine war started. Russia attacked Ukraine because Ukraine gave up on its nuclear weapons way back. So didn't we see this in past history and past experiences that nuclear weapon has deterrence effect?
Well, yes, although Ukraine never had a capability to employ nuclear weapons. They were under the control and the systems of the Soviet Union. So it's really an apples and oranges argument. And South Korea, of course, has never had nuclear weapons. And extended deterrence is what provides the deterrence against North Korea's nuclear weapons. So I think that argument actually applies more to Kim Jong-un than it does to South Korea. And it is, Kim Jong-un who assesses that anyone who gives up nuclear weapons is vulnerable, and which is one reason why I believe he will never give up nuclear weapons. When he looks at the Ukraine example, the Libya example, the Iraq example, all of those are deemed as mistakes, and he doesn't want to make that same mistake. But that doesn't apply to South Korea because of the ROK-US alliance.
Colonel Maxwell, a few years ago, South Korea contemplated terminating GSOMIA, but at the end of the day, doesn't North Korea's provocation actually led to more trilateral cooperation and information sharing?
Absolutely. And I think GSOMIA, we really need to set that issue aside. I think that was really a mistake by the previous administration in South Korea to try to somehow hold that hostage for the historical issues. It really makes no sense because the GSOMIA is very important to the national security of both countries and really trilaterally. The sharing of information directly between Korea and Japan is really critical to the defense of both countries. And I don't see that this administration, that President Yoon has any thought about ending the GSOMIA. And again, as we've seen, there are talks about direct sharing of missile launch information. And I look at these as steps really to the foundation for integrated missile defense. Again, something that China does not want to have happen.
Mr. Johnstone, some people in South Korea are concerned that North Korea's provocation may actually lead to trilateral Japan, South Korea, U.S. alliance, a step further from the current military cooperation. Is this a direction that Washington wants, and is this a direction that Tokyo wants?
I don't think we'll go in the direction of a formal trilateral alliance. But what I do think, to build on Dave's point, is we will see much more close trilateral seamless cooperation. The announcement last November of an agreement to begin real-time data sharing related to missile threats is a significant step forward and does take us down the path toward first step down the path toward an integrated missile defense architecture. I think we need to consider other forms of connectivity between these two alliances, liaison officers at CFC, ROK liaison officers at Japan's defense headquarters and at U.S. Forces Japan. I think we need to have planning cells in both commands that allow a greater synchronization of operations. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that the capabilities that Japan has announced that it will acquire, in particularly long-range precision strike, intended in part to address the missile threat from North Korea, require a much deeper level of military coordination among the three countries. Until now, that hasn't been a factor. Japan's response itself has not been something that we've had to think about as allies, the three of us, or that North Korea has had to think about. But in the next couple of years, this is where the Japanese will be, and it requires us to think differently, and it will be a new variable for Kim Jong-un to consider as well.
Mr. Johnstone, North Korea criticizes Japan's rearmament, but didn't North Korea's provocation was a strong motivation for Japan to build up its military program, just like how Korean War worked to reverse course for the United States and led to the founding of the self-defense forces?
Yeah, no question. And this is back to the point that Kim Jong-un's actions are making his environment less secure, not more. No question that North Korea and the threat from North Korea is a big part of the motivations for Japan's buildup. There are other factors as well. The perceived threat from China. Frankly, the war in Ukraine had a profound impact on Japanese public opinion. The recognition that major war is still possible in the 21st century and that the Japanese people need to be prepared to deal with that reality. So there are a number of factors, but there's no question that the proximity of the North Korean threat is very much back at the top of the list in Japan and motivating this focus on doubling the defense budget and acquiring for the first time what are in effect offensive capabilities.
Colonel Maxwell, Japan is actively engaging and participating in U.S.'s Indo-Pacific strategy, and prime example could be the Taiwan contingency, because Japan openly said that it will participate in the war in Taiwan, whereas South Korea didn't. But when we think about that scenario, is it possible that two Asian allies can have different levels of participation? Wouldn't South Korea need to participate comparable as Japan should there be a Taiwan contingency?
Short answer is no. I think Japan and Korea are two different situations. And I think they will both contribute to defense in the Indo-Pacific in their own ways. I think if there is a contingency in Taiwan, South Korea and the alliance on the peninsula has to be concerned first and foremost with deterring North Korean attack. And so that's a different calculus than Japan has. Japan's territory will be threatened, islands will be threatened, and it is committed to the defense of Taiwan. And I think that's very, very good and very important. But Korea has a different problem. And the forces that are in Korea are going to have to be focused on preventing any kind of attack from North Korea. Because what we don't want to see is a simultaneous contingency in both areas. And so deterrence will be the key. And South Korean forces are really the key to that deterrence, certainly on the ground. And the United States will face a dilemma and have to properly allocate resources to defend Taiwan and deter war in Korea.
U.S. has mutual defense agreement with South Korea. Wouldn't U.S. expect South Korea to engage actively as much as Japan should there be a Taiwan contingency?
Well, I think what I'd say about that is, just as Dave said, I mean, the focus is appropriately on the immediacy of this North Korean threat. What I will say is that it's clear to me that South Korea increasingly has a much broader sense of what its interests are, what its values are, and what it shares with the United States in that regard. I was really struck by the trilateral statement that was released after a meeting in Phnom Penh by President Biden, President Yoon, Prime Minister Kishida, in which they set out an agenda for the Indo-Pacific. So going much beyond the focus on the North Korean threat to talk about common interests, common values on a range of things, including economic issues. Setting aside the specific question of South Korea's role in Taiwan, I do think there's a sense of growing common interest broadly in a rules-based order, avoiding the use of force, preventing coercion across the region, and that the U.S., Japan, and South Korea are aligned on that front.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up our discussion here. Colonel Maxwell, Mr. Johnstone, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.